Hello, everyone, and welcome to American Thought Leaders, a special live episode with Epoch Times national editor Ivan Pentchoukov. Now, Ivan and I have been working on a special project for a little while now, for just under 2 months, and that is this documentary that we're actually publishing in a few hours, premiering at 8 p.m. Eastern U.S. time. It's titled DeSantis, Florida versus Lockdowns. So today we're going to talk about things related to coronavirus. Of course, vaccine mandates. That's what you probably saw in the thumbnail for the video. We're also going to talk about vaccine passports, and then just in general, what Florida has done, how Florida has done differently. Ivan was actually a pretty instrumental part of doing some of the research for this, in-depth profile of Governor Ron DeSantis, which we also call the documentary. But Ivan, before we start, since we're going to be talking about, basically vaccine-related policy, basically in Florida, they have actually enacted a law related to vaccine passports, essentially banning vaccine passports, as I understand it. Can you just quickly explain to me how that works over there?
Sure, Jan. In Florida, they have a prohibition on vaccine passports on entities tied to the state. So anything under the purview of the state, like say your Department of Health, or when you go to get your driver's license renewed at the DMV, those places cannot offer a vaccine passport to walk inside. The law does not apply to private entities. So, for example, if a movie theater or a sports venue or a supermarket requires that you show proof of vaccination to walk in there, or to walk in there maskless, that's still allowed, and that's actually part of a bigger concern that the governor told us about, that he believes the private entities requiring proof of vaccination could be a bigger problem than the public entities.
Oh, interesting. And why is that?
Well, because the United States, for the most part, is a country that built on private enterprise. So our daily life consists, we do interact a lot with public property, like highways and mass transportation, but a large part of our life it takes part on property, either be it virtual or physical, that belongs to private entities. Say, going to the supermarket, being on social media. These are the kinds of things that if private companies start requiring passports for those, a large segment of the population will feel completely cut out of regular life in the United States.
Well, so this is such an interesting question, right? And I'm going to jump to, and I usually wait a little bit before I jump to audience questions, but there were a few that I saw even before the live stream started that I thought were quite interesting. And in fact, one of them is, perfectly applicable here. Here's someone asking, I'm in the healthcare industry, and many employers are mandating vaccines as a condition of employment. That's happening as we speak. Is this legal? Like, what are people saying about this?
Well, I could give you a legal perspective, but I know that in public schools, universities, etc., vaccinations for things other than COVID have been standard practice for years. You couldn't go to most universities without proving that you've been vaccinated for a whole range of these diseases. And so when a lot of the universities, when they posted their vaccine mandates, they basically added them to the COVID to the list of the diseases that you have to be vaccinated against. So you see, measles and stuff on there. So my assumption is that they're using the same legal framework to require it.
So this actually speaks to another question that I saw, right, even before the live stream began, and I'll read it verbatim. There is no mandate because there can't be one. They can't mandate a freaking experiment. Okay, so there's an issue here, right? The issue is that these vaccines are experimental. We know that. And obviously, because they were kind of almost miraculously created so quickly, there hasn't been an opportunity to study them in these longitudinal studies that are typical of any treatment rollout and certainly vaccine rollout.
Yeah, and I think that the entities that are imposing these mandates are conscious of this question, and probably conscious of the risks of going with something that's experimental. So there are a couple of university systems that they've imposed the vaccine mandate, but it would only become effective once the vaccines receive full FDA approval. They will not go with it until there's full approval. We're probably going to see a full approval by the time the fall semester comes. So I guess it's just a matter of time for these universities. But there is a consciousness that we're working with a different kind of vaccines as compared to the ones that we've been familiar with for years.
Well, so exactly. I mean, while we're on this topic, I know you're not going to give me kind of an in-depth view necessarily here, but like, how are these vaccines different than what we've seen traditionally?
Well, two of the major approved vaccines are mRNA vaccines. That's not a vector we've tried before on especially on a massive scale. It doesn't say they're not safe. They've been proven safe. We're not seeing some people talk about the deaths of the people who've gotten the vaccine. There's no proof yet that the deaths are linked to the vaccines. But when it comes to the mRNA vaccines, they're experimental, and it's an experiment that we're really trying for the first time.
So Ivan, why don't you tell me a little bit about, you've written this really excellent paper a little while ago about this whole question of the vaccines in the universities that we just started to go over. Can you give me a bit of a thumbnail of what that looks like? What did you find?
Yeah, I sort of got the idea for the story from our work on the DeSantis piece, because some of the advisors that he's listened to when it comes to making decisions in Florida have pointed to the fact that many of the places mandating vaccines make no mention about people with acquired immunity from having COVID-19, acquiring antibodies. And there's plenty of studies, including studies by with Dr. Fauci on them, that show that acquired immunity is lasting, strong, and it's effective against variants. Yet, when you see these universities and other places who are mandating vaccination for COVID, they are never talking about acquired immunity. You cannot get an exemption from the vaccine mandate if you prove to the school that you have antibodies. And that is it seems really odd to me. I don't know why it's not a big deal. At the time I did the story, I surveyed all the schools that mandated the vaccine in the United States. That added up to about 2.5 million students. I'm sure a lot of them have acquired immunity over the past year, and none are eligible for exemption from the vaccine mandate, even though they're immune.
Well, it's really fascinating. And also, what is the impact of having someone that has actually had the disease and has acquired these antibodies on getting a vaccine? Like, what happens then? Is there any issue with that in itself?
Not per the CDC. So CDC advises that you still get the vaccine even if you've been ill with COVID.
Is there any other research around this that you're aware of?
Well, there is a researcher, I can't remember the country, in Europe, who was suggesting that the clotting issue was a result of people who are already immune from COVID getting vaccinated. I don't know. I believe his initial statements were all based on circumstantial evidence, and I do know that he at the time I read about it, he was committing to do a study on this. I don't know what the results of that are, but there is at least circumstantial evidence or circumstantial link between people who are immune getting vaccinated and then getting blood clots.
Fascinating. So we don't. So this is an area of research as we speak.
Yeah. I don't think there's anything final on that yet, that I'm aware of.
So, there's also, do you know anything about what the situation is with these vaccine mandates and historically Black colleges? This was a question I kind of had in my mind because I understand, based on the statistics, that African Americans, Black Americans are getting the vaccine at lower rates than average. Do you have any data on that?
I don't know if the list of the colleges was long. That I think at the time I was doing it, it was in more than 120 schools. And I didn't check specifically if any of them are historical Black colleges. But it is true and rarely mentioned by mainstream media that Black Americans are among the least likely groups to want to get the vaccine.
Have you seen any indications as to why that might be?
Well, from what I've read, I'm not an expert on this, but there's been a history among the Black community, the Hispanic community, of vaccine harm, and that's an entrenched issue, and it seems to be. We've spoken to some students actually here in New York, outside Columbia University, and it's a very, very small sample. But the Black students we spoke to, they're like, I'm not getting the vaccine. So that exists, and it does have to do with the history of how the United States has mandated vaccines either on state level or federal level before in these communities.
Oh, fascinating. I mean, there's some really, I think, important and valuable journalism to be done in this area, it would seem. Let's jump to a little bit to our documentary, which is actually, I want to kind of remind everybody. So Ivan and I have both been with a number of other Epoch Times staffers have been working on this new documentary. It's an in-depth profile for American thought leaders of Governor Ron DeSantis. It's called DeSantis, Florida versus Lockdowns. And it basically is looking at the governor through the lens of how he dealt with coronavirus in his state, and specifically the issue of lockdowns. Ivan, tell me a little bit about, kind of how this all began.
I got the idea to interview the governor around the time when mainstream media was finally coming around and admitting that his approach to handling the pandemic was basically vindicated. I thought it just the United States system of governance. It was fascinating that it allowed for this massive experiment in whether lockdowns work or not. As the state of Florida decided to not lock down over the winter, and we were going to get a massive circumstantial experiment on whether social distancing works, on whether lockdowns work, and by the time but by the turn of the year, when we're getting into mid-February, it was becoming clear that there was no massive spike in Florida. It was doing much better than some of the lockdown states, and even when it's compared to California, California has a lower death per capita per million, but the Florida is a much younger state. The California is a much younger state than Florida, and once you factor that in, Florida did even better than California, which has been, I guess, one of the biggest, strictest lockdown states throughout the first wave, second wave, etc.
And so, briefly give me kind of a thumbnail of your observations. We actually went, together to Florida as we were starting to film. This was in early April, and you were kind of on the ground playing a bit of a fly on the wall role for a while and saw some interesting things.
the governor in a, I guess for a stretch of time at a fair, walking around, greeting people, talking to people. And to me, the more interesting thing was not what he was saying, what he was doing. He was doing things you'd expect. He had a couple of canned phrases to throw to people he bumped into. But what the people were saying, you know, I've seen a lot of politicians doing their thing over the years, and you know, meeting their constituents or people at events, outside a press conference, you know. But I never saw so many people, and this was basically without exception, but with DeSantis, people were thanking him for what he was doing for them. You couldn't stage this stuff, you know. When we came into the fair before the governor arrived, we got a coffee from a coffee place, and I was chatting with the owner. He said if it wasn't for the governor, he wouldn't have opened a new location for his coffee business. And when the governor was walking by him later on during the fair, you know, the guy ran out and thanked him, and you know, you can't make this stuff up, basically. And you had all people from all walks of life coming up to him and saying, "Thank you for your basically thanking him for his policies and for taking a stand for Florida."
Well, right. You know, and actually, we briefly show this coffee business owner in the film that is coming up. Actually, you know, why don't we actually run the trailer momentarily? So, you know, in a nutshell, once again, DeSantis, Florida versus lockdowns. It'll be coming in just over 2 hours at 8 p.m. Eastern. And
fear is very powerful. And they bought into it because it was temporary.
For the younger populations, the lockdown is way more harmful than COVID.
I got an email from someone who said, "Dear Dr. Atlas, thank you for everything that you've been saying. I'm writing you today because my husband killed himself."
What's going on here?
When push came to shove, they advocated policies that have not worked against the virus, but have been very, very destructive.
This is not an inconvenience. This is a matter of life and death.
Within 24 hours, we informed the governor, and immediately the governor said, "Make it happen."
He's showing the public what his advisors are telling him.
He looked at the science, he looked at the data.
The lockdowns were really a departure from what the typical scientific recommendations had been for pandemics.
The American spirit, the independent American, where are these people?
This is bad for our country. Every single fact that I discussed was edited out. These union thugs would come and try to break up some of my press conferences. If you had been infected, then you...
But the decisions that he made are not just impulsive.
He knows what he wants to do. He wants to do the right things.
I think Governor DeSantis was a big part of that.
I don't mind people swinging at me. A leader is elected to lead. I'd rather them beat up on me than have someone lose their job.
This is an enormous tragedy.
Now, Google, YouTube has not been, throughout this pandemic, repositories of truth and scientific inquiry.
He doesn't back down from a challenge.
They're never going to admit they were wrong.
So that's DeSantis, Florida versus lockdowns, coming in just over a couple of hours on Epoch TV exclusively. And once again, we have here Ivan Pentchoukov, who was the main researcher for this documentary film. Ivan, what was some of your? We get to see a little bit of Governor DeSantis's personality here in this trailer, and that comes out also in the film. And what were your impressions as you were watching a bit from a distance there?
To me, one of the most telling details was one I observed early on in the day when we visited the governor's mansion. When the way he interacts with his kids is tells me that he's a very educated parent, that he's read some of the parenting books that I've seen. The way he poses questions to them, the way he gives them autonomy to decide what they're going to do. It sounds trivial to us, like, oh, do you want to go on the ride first, or do you want to go get cotton candy first? But to a kid, according to some parenting books that I've read, very popular parenting books, that's really empowering to make that decision. And he did it throughout the day, asking them these empowering questions, and that builds trust with your child. That by the end of the day, when the choice is difficult, like do you want to take a bath now, or should we brush our teeth? And the child doesn't want to do either. You've built up a bit of a credit with them over the course of the day, to be able to say, well, you know what, why don't we brush our teeth first? And I say that because DeSantis, as we learned throughout the research for the documentary and throughout the course of speaking to him, gets educated on the issues that he makes decisions on. And we've spoken to his advisors, these folks from Harvard, Stanford, who he would call up and speak to them for 2 hours, asking them about every paper that's been out there on COVID, social distancing, masks, all of these things. And some of the researchers we've spoken to, they said, he's read all the papers I read. So this is a governor that's heavily invested in deeply learning about the issue he's making moves on. And knowing that some of the decisions that we've been seeing criticized in mainstream media and in the press, once I found out how much thinking and research went into that, it was quite fascinating.
No, absolutely, I agree, and I think that's something that really comes through in the film. I mean, we endeavored to kind of, basically for us, I think, for me certainly, it was an exploration of how that decision making was done, because that decision making, especially early on, was really very much against the grain of what seemed to be the popular consensus.
And it wasn't an easy decision. He was under attack before he locked down the state. He did lock down the state briefly in April of 2020. But when they came out of that lockdown, and he said he's not going to do it again, he faced a lot of fire. And a lot of people were just, I would assume a lot of people were crossing their fingers that Florida would get a spike and then he would be proven wrong. But it's also not a light decision, because he was considering the harm of the lockdowns. He knew that the lockdowns can kill people in their own way for a whole number of issues, not going to emergency rooms, etc. And he was consciously calculating what is the harm of the lockdown, and is that harm outweighed by not locking down? And I think we didn't get the governor to be emotional in our interviews, but one of the press conferences we came across in which he's talking about the harm of the lockdowns, and where he just chokes up for a good 40 seconds. That really shows what was involved in that decision, and he was thinking about saving the lives of the people he was elected to be responsible for.
Absolutely. I mean, I think again, Florida versus lockdowns, DeSantis, Florida versus lockdowns, coming in just over a couple of hours, 8 p.m. Eastern on Epoch TV. So you can get there through epochtv.com/ATL, that's, or American Thought Leaders. So I guess the next question, I want to jump to a question from the audience, and this is a little bit, taking things internationally. So we have Norma Wong. She's asking, your thoughts on this. Why do you think Vietnam might have only had a very, very small numbers of deaths compared to, and I think it says 40, but I find that really hard to believe that it was only 40 deaths. But or 40,000. I'm not sure, but I know the numbers is very, very small compared to other countries in terms of numbers.
Not compared to North Korea, because nobody died of COVID in North Korea.
So
we're
you're saying
talking about
basically there's a little bit of messaging going on. That's what you're saying?
We're talking about, one of the last remaining communist regimes in the world, and they have no concern for truth or transparency. Even Russia, which is not on its face a communist regime, there's been a massive undercount of the deaths there, according to the New York Times, of all newspapers. So I'd not take any figures coming out of North Korea, Vietnam, and especially China seriously at all.
Well, so actually, let's talk about China for a moment. So this is, of course, China was the first place to lock down, and it kind of advertised this. But there was this whole scenario where basically they locked down Wuhan. There wasn't travel around to and from Wuhan internally, but there was travel allowed internationally to and from Wuhan. And then there was this kind of whole I guess, information war, or so to speak, against preventing that international travel. And so, what do you make of that? I've had a number of people on the show talking about it, including Gordon Chang. He has a very specific theory around why that was and how it worked. But what are your thoughts?
Well, that's one of the main points that Trump referenced when he was president, that DeSantis referenced when he spoke to us. And folks who are calling on the CCP to pay for, contributing to the virus's spread around the world, they reference specifically the situation in Wuhan. That is the most obvious malfeasance on behalf of the CCP, locking down the city internally, letting flights in and out. That's there's just no excusing that.
So, why do you think they did that? Do you have any sort of evidence that you've seen that would suggest why?
Well, I mean, just knowing how the CCP operates, they would know that if they shut down the airports, then people would know there's a pandemic, and they were trying to cover up the pandemic. So in trying to cover up the pandemic, they actually, made it spread across the world. That could be one way that, that's one of their modus operandi is to cover things up, and usually that the cover up, they end up shooting themselves in the foot. There could be other scenarios as well. Maybe they knew that closing the airports would send a signal internally in China and cause massive repercussions. So plenty of scenarios, including the fact that maybe they did the whole thing intentionally to make the world pay, so that the harm that was being caused to China would be balanced by the fact that China's, the rest of the world, which China considers a competitor, and a lot of it China considers an enemy, would be hurt as well.
So in this last theory, which is, for example, one that basically Gordon Chang would say that the CCP, if it wasn't a weapon from the beginning, which we don't know, they certainly weaponized it, effectively weaponized it through their policy, their subsequent policy. And there's also this element of basically the WHO saying it wasn't contagious, presumably at the behest of the CCP, at a time when it seems pretty clear that Chinese scientists, or at least some of them, would have known that it most definitely is human-to-human transmissible.
Yeah, to me, that's another shade of cover-up. Once again, the CCP tries to avoid an international embarrassment at all costs. And by that time, it was already too late. So it was going to be an embarrassment anyway, and they were trying to see if they can. They were trying to do damage control. I think that's one plausible theory. And as you mentioned, as Gordon Chang was saying, the CCP has a ranking system. I forgot the name of it, but basically they keep an active ranking system of all of the nations in the entire world and they use a barrage of factors to calculate which country is the most powerful country. Economic factors, political factors, and such. Technology. The United States is on top, and China is in second place, and that is a live system which officials at the top of the party watch on a nearly nonstop basis, because the factors are constantly fed into there. So I would think that when COVID hit in China, the calculations went way haywire, because if you start calculating the damage a pandemic is doing and how that what'll happen if it keeps on going, China probably started sliding down that list. And I would assume in their thinking, their top goal is to at least stay number 2. So there's plenty of motivation, plenty of a motive to harm the rest of the world, so that the slide would basically be, leveled off by the harm done to the other countries.
Ivan, so of course, there's been a flurry of interest in the last, I think it's a month now, about this lab leak theory. This theory was something that was being looked at, over a year ago. We actually did a documentary at Epoch Times, which you're well aware of, tracking down the origins of Wuhan coronavirus, which explores that theory, certainly by looking at the fact that there was coronavirus research being done at the Wuhan lab, that there was gain of function research, all this sort of circumstantial evidence there. So now, but for the better part of a year, it's been kind of, incredibly taboo, to the point that you could be deplatformed or marked as, fake news or whatever by social media platforms and these, legacy or corporate media, to even suggest that this is a possibility. It looked to me like people are actually intentionally conflating the lab leak concept with a bioweapon concept, just calling it all bioweapon conspiracy theory in a lot of cases. So now we're the thing is flipped a bit, right? We're seeing that a lot of these media, which before were yelling conspiracy theory, now are saying, oh, there might be truth to this, right? Or even more than that. So I guess the question is, and of course the CCP is responding to this in its own way. It's kind of resurfaced this idea that the virus might have come from Fort Detrick, for example, right? Which is something they were saying, I guess about a year ago. I can't remember exactly. So what do you make of this whole milieu and this change? And do you think the CCP will be able to, again, hide this very, very damaging theory as it did for, it seems like, a considerable time with inadvertent or advertent help of many media and social media?
Yeah, I think the last part of it, what you said, is the most important, because the CCP had no trouble getting its message out, because the mainstream media and social media quickly jumped on board and deplatformed and censored everyone who didn't agree. There was they had no problem trusting the most murderous communist regime in history. That's known for manipulating information internally, externally, controlling all the media in the mainland. They just ate it up. There were no questions, and in part because this was a highly politically charged year, and it was quite obvious. And this is DeSantis' opinion, that a lot of this line of thinking, a lot of this censoring and deplatforming was done because the narrative that they adopted was the narrative that was most harmful to President Donald Trump at the time, in an election year.
So you're saying that you think that, these are, very, very serious things to adopt narratives about, for purely political reasons. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm a reporter, so I can't quite opinionate, but I can tell you that's the opinion of DeSantis. That's Trump's opinion. He was saying that on the campaign trail. that the Democrats are using the pandemic and lockdowns to harm the country economically and to harm him politically as a result of the economic collapse and as a result of the things that were happening due to these lockdowns. When you cut off people's means of meeting, getting together, and sort of communicating, you eliminate the ability of this really powerful means of convincing or changing people's minds. When friends meet at a party and someone they really trust and like tells them, hey, whatever the political issue is, it's very easy to change your mind face to face. It's much harder to do from the television screen and from social media, but it's certainly doable. Except that I think as folks have learned, the programming that can be done on television and social media can be quickly undone in a face-to-face meeting or just interpersonal communication, which the lockdowns suffocated.
So it's a really fascinating perspective, but there's also this sort of element. There was just this kind of mania. It's something that's been described as a madness of crowds or something like that. Like, basically people are sort of quick to jump on the bandwagon. So sure, there might be some, bad political actors and so forth, but there's this to me, just kind of watching all this unfold, I see kind of this sort of element here, right?
Well, yeah, I think if even Joe Biden's campaign, the battle for the soul of our nation, I think what's happened in 2020 is a perfect storm of one of the most highly politically charged elections in our lifetime, and a global pandemic that we most people have. I shouldn't even say most. I don't know if there are any living people who've experienced a bigger pandemic than this, and at a time in our nation where the media have for the most part adopted a very flexible approach to truth, a very subjective approach to truth. And I think we saw a lot of these things. The media are walking back now. Now all of a sudden, PolitiFact says, we're just gonna yank back that conspiracy theory article about the lab leak theory, even though there was plenty of evidence. How could they ignore it for so long? But not eventually. There's just no ignoring it anymore. And I think we're starting to see more and more of that.
Do you think we're going to see that with other areas? So one of the lines that I remember that's in this DeSantis documentary is where he says, they're never going to admit they were wrong, right? And this is when it comes to the whole lockdown question, right? Because obviously the economic and cost and social cost is discussed. The obvious economic cost of the lockdowns is massive, in the trillions of dollars. And then, of course, there's this whole kind of social cost that we explore in the documentary too. But so when it comes to the lab leak theory, it seems like some people are beginning to be ready to admit they were wrong, or at least, pretend like they kind of thought that it was a possibility when they didn't really. What about with the lockdowns?
I think we're seeing a similar situation with the lockdowns, or I think the more specific case that sort of gives a clear look into the situation is the mask mandates. So we have many of the liberal lockdown states lifting mask mandates for people who've been fully vaccinated, but not asking for proof. So you've got a situation where people who hated masks from the beginning and believed they don't work, going into stores, etc., in, I guess, violation of the state requirements for masks. I think that it's possible. One possible theory for why it was done like that is that it's a safe way to backpedal on the masks, because you've got an exit. you're sort of making both groups happy. The people who believe in masks and vaccines, and those who are skeptical or just think that things shouldn't be mandated. They care more about their freedom than the relatively low risk of infection or relatively low risk of adverse outcome for an infection, especially for young people. So I think the way that the mask mandates have been lifted suggests that there's this isn't only about vaccines. It's backpedaling on the fact that masks don't work.
Oh, fun. Very interesting. Although, have you done a kind of literature review around the masks? I've seen a little bit of that being done. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, to this day, there is still no randomized controlled trial showing that masks work, which is, randomized controlled trials are the gold standard of science.
Let's just be specific. So that masks work to do what?
There is no randomized controlled trial showing that masks help prevent you from spreading the virus or you from catching the virus. There is no randomized controlled trial of that. There are dozens of circumstantial studies. So, for example, an example of a circumstantial study is, a New York to San Francisco flight with 330 passengers on board. And according to the stories from the flight attendants, all of the passengers wore masks the whole time. After the flight, they found out that, say, one person was infected on that flight, and then go and they do a trace on all the passengers who were in the plane. They find nobody's got COVID, and so they say, "Oh, masks work." Of course, if you ask any scientist if that's scientific, they will say no. But it is still a fair argument to say, well, if you've got 48 of instances like that, then masks must have something to do with it. Although that's not what we use to approve to let you take Tylenol without a prescription or a number of other medical issues.
I want to jump back to this idea of, basically people who are being vaccinated don't need to wear masks anymore. And in most cases, there's no kind of, checking or enforcement. I mean, just frankly, the idea strikes me as a little bit preposterous personally. But in Oregon, I'm told that indeed there is some kind of rule that says that you can't, that basically I think it's stores need to check if people come in without a mask. Now, the thing that strikes me about this is it creates a kind of a scarlet letter type situation almost, right? Where it's like the only people who would be wearing masks would be people who are self-identifying publicly as not having been taken the vaccine or something like that. So inviting a social stigma of sorts. I mean, the whole thing is just kind of a weird thought experiment to me. But what do you think of this? And I know there's been people asking in the audience about whether these types of things are legal. So maybe get your thoughts on that too, whether you've heard any discussion about this.
Well, I think the Oregon mandate on this is ripe for, and we'll probably see a legal challenge. But I don't think we've seen anything like that in the United States, where the state is telling the totality of private enterprises within it that if they want to let people in maskless to shop or to do whatever, they have to check their vaccination status before they walk into the business. I think that's quite incredible, and something tells me that we're going to see a legal challenge in Oregon.
But what about this, the other element that I referenced, that it's, kind of sets up this situation, right? That everyone that's basically wearing a mask is sort of seems to be identifying themselves as not having taken the vaccine, which, there's this kind of, massive social messaging that's happening that everyone should have the vaccine, right? So what do you think about that?
Well, I'd say that there are people who are vaccinated who still wear masks. I've seen some posts on Twitter saying, I still wear a mask because I don't want to look like a conservative. So there's still a lot of ridiculous things, and you can never assume why someone's wearing a mask, whether they're vaccinated or not. I think that whole thing is still, there's plenty of unknowns there.
Fascinating. Well, I'm gonna remind everybody very quickly that at in just over a couple of hours we're going to be premiering DeSantis, Florida versus lockdowns. I'm here with Ivan Pentchoukov, who is a national editor for the Epoch Times, and we both worked on this documentary together. He was one of the key researchers for the documentary. I want to just jump back to talking about it, for example, for a little bit. And so you actually, from the material that we gathered talking to various experts, in addition to the governor, and you wrote a couple of pieces. And one of them was with respect to the lockdowns, you basically noted that, that the governor has regrets for having done it, right?
Yeah, he's there are while he was careful in how he explained himself to us, there are how you say it, second source quotes of him saying it's his biggest regret as a governor. But he said as much when we spoke to him as well. He locked down on April 1st, 2020. Not as strict as many of the other states. People were still allowed to go and do recreation outside. Golf courses were open, etc. But it was a pretty major lockdown. And by the time that after 30 days, his mind was more or less changed in the whole thing. And Florida saw a phased reopening heading all the way to September. And what was happening in Florida and happening all across the United States as well is that you had a state mandate, but also localities were imposing their own mandates. So by the time September came in Florida and they lifted the last, the very last remainders of their mandate, what happened in Florida is that DeSantis had local authorities who still had many of these mandates in place. And what he did is actually, I think, go beyond lifting his state order and to actually restrict localities from imposing lockdowns, and basically that his executive order prohibited local authorities from restricting people from operating a business and going to work. I think the only exception was restaurants, where there was more of a phased-in approach. But otherwise, across the board, local authorities could not prevent something from going to work and operating their business, which I think was a huge deal. That was more than just lifting a mandate. That was really taking his powers as governor in a very, I guess, he risked being called an authoritarian or whatever it is. But he was convinced, based on the data, based on the experts he spoke to, that was the right thing to do, and he went with it. And I think the documentary, when we ask him about why, he gives some really strong, fascinating answers.
No, absolutely. And one of the things, so when we were, I think it was actually, the first time we went to Florida, I went to Florida, was when we were there together, was April 1st. It was actually a year to the day, right, of that initial lockdown in Florida. Even compared to New York, where I spend a lot of my time, to me there was a kind of a sense of freedom there in Florida, which it was really interesting to see. Like I guess maybe it was more of a lack of fear, because that's something that I've come to notice and expect, on the streets of New York. That has actually changed quite a bit now in recent weeks. Again, just to my eye. But in Florida, it just felt like the society was just kind of functioning in a different way, like seemingly with less fear. This is obviously, this is not data driven. This is just my own observations of being there on the ground. What was your sense?
Well, I mean, for anyone who's been to Florida recently, that certainly feels that way. A lot of people from My cousin from New York City, during the first wave, he took his family over there for 6 months, rented an apartment. And when the second wave came in New York over the winter, they went again. And you see a lot of that. You see a lot of people fleeing to Florida because of the policies that the state has adopted protecting people's liberty. And when we were at the fair, I mean, there's still a few people wearing masks. I guess it wasn't a surprise that at least some people will be wearing them, but I think it was, 98% weren't wearing masks. It was very liberating to see because I never see that in New York. And certainly, I think. I got some feedback there. I don't know if we're still on, Jan.
I think
Can you hear me?
I think they're playing the trailer, but I can't hear the audio of it. So let's see if they're going to restart it. I don't know what.
I see. Maybe there we go.
Fear is very powerful, and they bought into it because it was temporary.
For the younger populations, the lockdown is way more harmful than COVID.
I got an email from someone who said, "Dear Dr. Atlas, thank you for everything that you've been saying. I'm writing you today because my husband killed himself."
What's going on here?
When push came to shove, they advocated policies that have not worked against the virus, but have been very, very destructive.
This is not inconvenience. This is a matter of life and death.
Within 24 hours, we informed the governor, and immediately the governor said, make it happen.
He's showing the public what his advisors are telling him.
He looked at the science, he looked at the data.
The lockdowns were really a departure from what the typical scientific recommendations had been for pandemics.
The American spirit, the independent American, where are these people?
This is bad for our country. Every single fact that I discussed was edited out. These union thugs would come and try to break up some of my press conferences. If you had been infected, then you...
But the decisions that he made are not just impulsive.
He knows what he wants to do. He wants to do the right things.
I think Governor DeSantis was a big part of that.
I don't mind people swinging at me. A leader is elected to lead. I'd rather them beat up on me than have someone lose their job.
This is an enormous tragedy.
Now, Google, YouTube has not been, throughout this pandemic, repositories of truth and scientific inquiry.
He doesn't back down from a challenge.
They're never going to admit they were wrong.
So, we have a few minutes left in our live here today. I want to encourage all of our viewers to actually write in questions. We still have an opportunity to answer a few. I've been mostly doing my own questions up to now. Yes?
I, for some reason, can't hear you.
Oh, Irene?
I'm going to quickly reconnect.
So we seem to have lost Ivan briefly. He's reconnecting with us. So we're here in a live Q&A with Ivan Pentchoukov. Ivan is the national editor for the Epoch Times. He's been covering a whole range of issues, but among them, vaccine mandates in universities. We talked about that earlier in this live Q&A. We've been looking at, of course, this whole question of how Florida has dealt with the pandemic. This is kind of dealt with in a more in-depth way in this upcoming documentary. We just showed the trailer for DeSantis, Florida versus lockdowns. And hopefully we'll get Ivan back here at any moment to basically finish up the Q&A with you. I want to invite everybody who is watching to please add your questions to the chat so we can answer a few more questions before we finish up tonight.
All right, Jan, I can finally hear you.
Okay, well, fantastic. I'm glad to have you back, Ivan. So, Ivan, what are you working on now? What can we expect from your work in the coming days and weeks?
We're my team's working on actually quite a bit of Memorial Day content. So obviously we'll see some articles on Memorial Day, but the Epoch Times is planning to actually turn it into a bit of a Memorial Month and speak to our veterans, speak to the families of our fallen veterans, and really elevate this issue rather than for just a day, but for a whole month, which is something I think is super exciting. I love tales of heroism, and what's happening with our veterans across the nation today is actually quite interesting to me. So I think our readers will be seeing a lot more of that in June.
Well, but maybe can you just give me a hint as to, what is one of the things that really has grabbed your imagination in sort of developing this whole topic? Fascinating to me too, by the way.
You mean you talking about the documentary, or
the question, you're going to be digging into veterans issues, right? And
yeah,
and I'm just very curious, what are some of the lines of thinking or lines of inquiry that you're pursuing, or one of them at least?
Well, to me, it feels as though veterans, or what our armed forces do for us, and what our heroes have done for us in the past, is a huge deal to conservatives. Yet we only have a few days in the year when that's celebrated. Meanwhile, for certain other topics, which are extremely important in their own right, we have whole months dedicated to them. Or we see, it seems to be the corporate media jumps onto the topics that rarely have to do with veterans. They seem to have a much more progressive agenda as far as promoting something or celebrating something at a given time. And the Epoch Times, our two big principle is true tradition, and I think honoring, respecting, and remembering our veterans and the people who fought for this country is important enough to do it for a whole month.
Okay, we've got a specific question for you, Ivan. We'll see how you answer this. The question is Ivan Russian, and do you love Russia?
I am Russian, but I love the United States. I came from Russia to the United States in 1999. I am not a big a fan of a country now, and I wasn't when I came here. A lot of it has to do with Russia's communist roots, which are still, for the most part, if you go, the city I'm from is called Ivanovo. If you go to any local city outside of Moscow and try to get anything done, you'll feel like you're in a communist country. So I have I am proud of what Russian authors and artists have accomplished over the centuries. But if you ask me about the country as it is now, I'm a U.S. citizen. I love the United States. Russia has a long way to go.
No, I know. I can I understand where you're coming from. My parents had to leave, basically escape from communist Poland, as I usually say it, in 1970. Basically to come to North America. For I don't know, perhaps some similar reasons to your family. I don't know exactly what your situation was. I'm still looking here. I'm still trying to see if we're getting any more questions into our feed. I'm not seeing that many. Ivan, any final thoughts before we kind of close up this live?
Well, one of the most interesting things I noticed that about this, I shouldn't say most interesting, but there was a nice little symbolic item that he has. There's a mug saying "Make America Florida." We asked him about it recently when we were at when I was following him around for a couple hours at the fair. There were people actually wearing "Make America Florida" T-shirts. So I think DeSantis would not give us a word about whether he's thinking about running for president. But he is, if in the surveys that say, if Trump wasn't running, who would you go for? DeSantis on the top. And I think as far as politics go, this is a top mind issue when it comes to DeSantis. And I think, if anything, there are plenty of interesting lenses to view this documentary through, especially the main topic. But I think it's also really interesting to consider what would a man like DeSantis do if he had, if he was facing a crisis like this on a national level. How would these approaches work beyond Florida's borders? I think that's interesting because you can't escape as far as politics go the fact that he's being rumored as a top contender for 2024.
Well, Ivan Pentchoukov, it's so great to have you on American Thought Leaders on this live, and I hope everybody will come and join us to watch DeSantis, Florida versus lockdowns in just a couple of hours here on Epoch TV. EpochTV.com/ATL to subscribe if you're not already subscribed to Epoch Times or Epoch TV. Have a good night, everybody.